Welcome to part 3 of the Waldenses, the forgotten forerunners of the Protestant Reformation. Hi, I'm Mike Avalon. In this program, we'll continue to study the persecution of the Waldenses, and this history will lead us to their exile, and then from their exile we will look at them in their glorious return. But first we're going to visit a dungeon where many Waldenses gave their life for Christ, and also Ellen White visited this place over 100 years ago. Let's see what it looks like today.
Okay, we're standing here in a little field behind the Roman church here in Torre Pellice. And there have always been two churches in the valleys. Frequently they're very close together, the Waldensian church and the Roman church. And some of the historical records that we have reviewed talk about a fort, which we will see later this morning, up on the hill here, that was actually controlled eventually by the House of Savoy. And they used to take a lot of the Waldenses, men, women, and children, imprison them, and there were two tunnels up there. One tunnel comes down to this church, and another tunnel goes to a house that was used as a convent in those days. And we have some evidence that many Waldenses lost their lives in this area of the tunnels going down to these two locations. And so we will be visiting those tunnels up on the fort a little later this morning.
It's hard to believe that under this beautiful edifice is one of the tunnels where hundreds of Waldenses were martyred for just having the Word of God. Very soon the straight testimony will be preached again, and persecution will break out like those of old.
Here we are at Fort Santa Maria, up above Torre Pellice, and right behind us on the mountain over here is an ancient Waldensian church that they used for about 300 years, and Pastor Esteban Janavel is going to explain a little bit about interesting history, what happened here regarding this church. Entonces, ¿qué pasó con esta iglesia?
Bueno, al fondo tenemos la antigua Torre Pellice.
Oh, behind us we have the old Torre Pellice, ancient Torre Pellice.
Y podemos ver a lo lejos el campanario y la iglesia, el templo valdense de Icopieri.
So the Waldensian temple, Icopieri, is right back over here. It's an ancient Waldensian temple.
Fue construido en el límite máximo permitido a los valdenses de habitar en el valle.
It was constructed at the very border, or the limit, the lower limits of where the Waldensians were permitted to come down from the mountains to live or to construct anything.
A los valdenses les estaba prohibido permanecer y vivir en la parte baja del valle donde era más fértil.
The Waldenses were forbidden to come down into the fertile valley. They had to stay above a certain level.
Por ejemplo, se recuerda que en los años de guerra, especialmente en 1663,
in 1663, during the times of war,
los valdenses se reunían al culto y haciendo asambleas en el templo de Icopieri.
The Waldenses would assemble there and have worship services in the Icopieri temple.
Y cuando esto sucedía, los soldados de aquí del fuerte disparaban con sus fusiles o cañones de bajo calibre a los valdenses que estaban reunidos.
And during that time, the soldiers up here on this area where we're standing at the fort would shoot their guns and cannons of low caliber, and they would shoot them at the people that were assembling there at that church.
Y se dice que los hombres de Janavel, el héroe valdense, se subían al techo del templo y correspondían a los disparos.
And it's recorded that Joshua Janavel, and some of his men would actually climb up on the roof, on the rafters in the roof of that temple that we see over there, and they would shoot back and try to defend themselves against the soldiers that were just taking pot shots at the people coming in and out of the church. If I look over here to the left, I can see the fort, Santa Maria Fort, where they had the soldiers, and so it was a very dangerous place to worship in those days. But people were willing to risk their life to go to church, and I wonder today, how many of us are willing to go to church if there's a good chance that we're going to be shot at?
Esto nos da una idea de cuán difícil era la vida y la supervivencia en esos tiempos aquí en Torre Pellice.
This gives us an idea of how hard it was to survive back in those days in Torre Pellice.
Este lugar fue construido como fortificación militar.
This place was constructed as a military fort.
Aproximadamente al inicio del 1500.
About the start of 1500.
En realidad, el único sentido de la construcción de este sitio fue la represión y control de las poblaciones valdenses.
The main purpose of this fort was to control and repress the Waldensian people here in this valley.
Even today, you can still see the walls and the bridge that leads to the fort. Just inside this entrance is a field where once stood a convent called St. Maria. It is here where the Waldenses were questioned by inquisitors.
We're here at a very special place. Actually, I feel like I'm on sacred ground here, as you will see in a minute. Some very, very terrible things happened right here to God's people. This is up on top of the fort, within the walls of the fort, the inner walls. And right here is where they took the Waldenses, and they took them down into these tunnels, and they did all kinds of things to them before they took them down the tunnels, and sometimes in the tunnels. And there are two tunnels down here. One tunnel, I believe it's the one to the right, goes to the Catholic Church down below, and the other one went to a house which was being used as a convent, and it was close to a cemetery that they had down there for the Catholic Church. We can't get in that area right now. So the interesting thing is that there's a book that most people have never read. It's called Historical Sketches of Seventh-day Adventists in Europe. And Mrs. White, Ellen G. White, made 3 trips to Europe. And in here, she describes her visit to this actual spot. And I don't have the exact quotation because we didn't bring the book with us today. But in this book, she says that she actually climbed down in one of her visits here to Torre Pellice in the 1800s. She actually crawled down in here, and because there's a lot of moisture here, she thought that the green vines going down in there had moisture on it, and she said they were like pearls shining in the sun. And today you can see the vines growing down there, and so it's an amazing story where she said that in these tunnels, she said God showed her that there were some terrible, terrible things that happened to the Waldenses. Their children were kidnapped and tortured and everything and put in here. The women were all kinds. She said there are things done in these 2 tunnels to the Waldenses that are unfit for any human pen to describe. It was so terrible. She said only in the judgment, I'm paraphrasing her statement from that book, she said only in the judgment day will things be brought out which were done in here to God's people. And so we're going to go down in here. Right now it's been kind of like almost like a garbage dump, so we have to be careful. It's dark in there, and they've blocked off both of the tunnels after about 8 feet or 10 feet. So I wouldn't even want to crawl down in those tunnels now because it's been so long it might cave in on us. So we're just going to go into the opening of the tunnels, and we'll try to show that there are 2 tunnels there. And as you'll see, there's some garbage and cans and broken bottles and things, but at least you'll get a feel and to realize that Ellen White wrote this about this very spot. So it's a sacred spot, and pray for the descendants of these people that they will rekindle their faith. Like Ellen White prophesied that in the last days that many Waldenses would come back to the faith of their fathers through the efforts of Waldenses that would, their own people, that would accept the remnant church and accept the message of the 3 angels and the soon coming of Jesus.
Now we will look at this sad but amazing spot. As Ron climbs down into the hole in the ground, he has to be careful to see if there's any snakes or animals that could be living in this place as a shelter. It's interesting that it's the first time for a Stefan to be in this dungeon. If it wasn't for Ellen White's description of the place, we would have never found this hole in the ground. The entrance into this dungeon is very low, and it is hard to see after being in the bright sun. As I begin my descent, you can see the same vines that Ellen White saw over 100 years ago. It's amazing that they're still growing here. As I come around the corner, a large room opens up to our view, and we can see the 2 tunnels.
Okay, now here we are inside the tunnel, the opening to the tunnel. Since I was here several years ago, they have poured cement. You can see down here. This is all cement right up here. All cement, and this tunnel has been closed. You can see right here, see it?
As we look at this ceiling, we realize that it's an arch and keystone construction, which makes it very strong. I want to take a better look at this opening here where it used to be, so we can really see that it really was an opening. As you can see here, there is not just the moisture that has run down this wall makes it look like there's a demarcation, but that's not the demarcation. The demarcation is actually right over here. You can see a line that comes right over to here, and then down at the bottom here, you can see the extra stones that were added to about right over here, and then it goes up right about here. So this is the demarcation. As you can see, like this is the lintel area here. This part was added extra, filling this area up, and they're trying to disguise it that it didn't happen here, but actually there is an opening that goes through here. Later we were able to obtain this photo that revealed a second blockage in the tunnel.
And here's the other one over on this side, and we can point it right around to the left. And I'm going to crawl in there. That's the other tunnel. Stopped up this one too, see with dirt. And this is the one that went all the way down to Torre Pellice. Can you imagine what it was like when you'd already been tortured and probably half alive and mistreated in every way possible, to then be brought down in here knowing that this was your certain death, that you would never see the light of day again? And it was amazing to be here in the exact spot. So we are standing in a spot that was witnessed many atrocities. And sometimes people were killed in this very spot right here, and then their bodies were taken down and put in the cemetery in a secret way. I'd like to ask Pastor Esteban if he has any comments to make about this? ¿Tiene algún comentario sobre esto, pastor?
Bueno, creo que es importante resaltar el tipo de historia que hay aquí.
It's important to kind of review and jump back to the history of this place.
En la comunidad valdense siempre se ha transmitido oralmente una serie de cuentos y de acontecimientos.
In the Waldensian history, they have a tradition of passing down stories and happenings.
Hay también documentación,
There's documentation,
pero en relación a la historia macabra de este sitio,
but in relationship to the macabre history here,
los relatos oficiales tratan de minimizar y de esconder muchas de estas situaciones.
so the official records try to hide and to minimize what happened down in here.
Porque crearía o reavivaría muchas enemistades.
Because otherwise it would create a revival of enmity and all kinds of bad feelings against them.
Pero si realmente sucediera lo que históricamente merece este sitio,
But if the things that happened historically that in this very place,
estoy seguro que llegaremos a descubrir muchas cosas.
I'm sure in reality we would discover many things.
Personalmente creo que es necesario una revisión histórica
I really personally believe that we need to review history.
y no conformarse a lo que es políticamente correcto.
And let's not, we don't need to stick with what's politically correct.
Leaving the tunnels, we find a small road that skirts the fort. As we walk down this beautiful street, we find the main entrance into the walls. Eventually we come to this closed and overgrown cemetery where there are no markers that could be seen. It is here where mass graves of Waldenses lie, waiting for Jesus to come. The next day we head off to follow the exile route. This is the highway that crosses over the Cochin Alps down to southern France. As we wind our way up this beautiful mountain, we come to a place where the Waldenses died of malnutrition and hypothermia. After spending time enjoying the fresh morning air, we head off to our location. The early morning scenery is unsurpassed as we continue our climb to the top. This pass was amazing. With its elevation of 2,000 meters, it takes you along the ancient road that Paul crossed on his journey to Italy. And not to mention, this location is also where General Berthier, which was under the command of Napoleon, crossed these very mountains to come and take the Pope captive in 1798. We finally arrive at this amazing summit. Pastor Stefan tells us that up here in the cold Manzanese, in the pass between Italy and France, that during January and February of 1687, that the Waldenses that were liberated from their prisons that survived privation and torture were escorted by soldiers of the Savoy, while the priest stood watching to make sure that the Waldenses would not come back, and hoping that they would die in the frigid cold. They made their way through France to Geneva, Switzerland.
Los que habían sobrevivido
The ones that had survived,
fueron escoltados por el ejército de Saboya
they were escorted escorted by the soldiers of the Savoys.
y hacia el exilio en Ginebra.
And they were on their way to the exile to Geneva.
Y el grupo principal que se detiene aquí
The main group that stayed here for a little while,
en febrero del 1687,
in February of 1687,
hacen etapa en este lugar,
they stayed here for a little while.
y la crónica dice
The chronicles say
que esa noche que estuvieron aquí,
the night that they spent here,
47 personas murieron esa noche.
47 people died right here that night.
Entre ellos,
Among them,
6 soldados.
6 soldiers even died.
Es decir, los soldados estaban bien equipados.
That is to say, the soldiers who were well equipped and dressed,
Los soldados tenían abrigo,
they had overcoats,
tenían comida,
they had food,
y aún así el frío los mató.
and even then the cold killed them.
Imaginemos cuánto era el sufrimiento para estos pobres valdenses que salían después de haber sobrevivido a 9 meses de prisión, mal vestidos, enfermos y sin comer.
Imagine what it was like for those poor Waldenses that after 9 months of not having enough food and they were malnourished and sick and they didn't have any good warm clothes. Imagine what it was like for them.
La única fuerza motriz en sus corazones era la esperanza de llegar a la libertad.
The only thing that sustained them, the only thing that gave them strength was their hope for liberty.
Y
Be
todos alimentaban en su corazón poder llegar a Ginebra y encontrar a alguno de sus amigos o familiares que hayan sobrevivido.
They were just hoping that they could possibly make it to Geneva, where they could find people and maybe some friends or relatives that would give them food and clothes and help them survive.
Se alentaban unos a otros.
They helped each other.
Verás que vamos a encontrar a nuestros seres queridos en Ginebra.
Don't worry, he says, they encouraged each other. They said, we're going to see some of our loved ones in Geneva. That's how they encouraged themselves to make it through that night.
Y en este lugar, en el 1687, había 2 pequeños lagos.
In 1687, in this very place, there were 2 small lakes.
Hoy día el lago es más grande, es un dique,
Now there's a big dam here.
pero el sendero original del camino
But the pathway and the original roadway through here,
lo encontramos en estas piedras.
we find right here on these rocks. These are the signposts from that actual road. These rocks right here.
Y una de las fortificaciones en que formaron parte la permanencia de ellos, la vemos de aquel lado.
And some of these actually came from that fort right over there.
Allí había una guarnición del ejército sabaudo.
There was a Savoyan guard up there, army post up on that in that fort.
Y hay que entender también
We have to also understand that
que hoy día es una zona de frontera.
it's a border today,
Pero en aquel entonces,
but in those days,
sea del lado italiano que del lado francés,
the French side, the French side or the Italian side,
pertenecía todo a la Casa Real de Saboya.
all of this belonged to the House of Savoy.
Que la religión del soberano
That the religion of the sovereign
debía ser la religión del pueblo.
had to be the religion of the people.
Los súbditos profesan la misma religión del soberano.
The subjects had to they had to have the same religion, profess the same religion as the sovereigns did.
El pueblo valdense no profesaba la religión del soberano.
But the Waldensian population, they didn't profess the same religion as the sovereign kings.
Y por ese solo motivo
For that reason alone,
eran fuera de la ley.
they were outside of the law. They were outcasts.
As we continue our research, we cross into France and we start our decline to the valley below. On our way down the mountain of southern France, we find this monument. Many years before Christ, the Romans would import elephants. Like tanks, the Romans would use these beasts to terrify the residents and to take over this land. As you come down the pass, you will arrive at several little towns that has the ambiance that only France can give. This little village sits between two rugged mountain Alps. In this place is a statue that cannot be ignored. It is a Waldense woman with her hand on her face.
Esta zona de la Alta Saboya,
This zone of the High Savoy,
hasta mitad del 1400,
until about the middle of the 1400s,
la mayoría de la población era valdense.
most of the people here at that time were Waldenses.
Dice que la población local, viendo la miseria de estas personas,
It is told that the people in these towns, when they saw the misery of these people coming through,
salieron a su encuentro ofreciéndoles un pedazo de pan.
they came out and offered him a piece of bread.
Y esto nos hace reflexionar y pensar
This makes us remember and to think
en el sufrimiento, en el dolor
about the suffering and the pain.
del destierro
Exile, the pain and suffering of the exile,
por causa de la fe.
because of their faith.
After leaving the little villages along the exile route, we come eventually to a castle in the side of a mountain. This castle looks like a picture out of a medieval storybook, and its size is massive.
We're here in front of the castle of Mioland in France,
En la región de la Alta Saboya.
in the region of the territory of the High Savoy. This castle is very famous because of the cruelty that took place in the dungeons,
Particularmente en el período del exilio valdense,
and especially in the time of the exile of the Waldenses.
la familia real de Saboya era propietaria de este castillo.
The royal family of Savoy were the proper or the owners of the castle.
Y aquí funcionaban una serie de cárceles, de prisiones.
And there were different kinds of prisons.
Cuando el exilio, muchos pasaron por aquí momentáneamente,
As they were going to Geneva, they stopped here temporarily.
pero la cosa más importante fue que en este lugar vivieron la prisión muchos de los pastores valdenses y sus familias.
The main thing is that in this prison, in the dungeons, in the castle, the ministers and the family were there.
Especialmente hubieron entre todos los pastores que estuvieron encarcelados, solo 2 de ellos se pudieron salvar.
Only 2 pastors were able to leave the dungeons and escaped or able to remain alive,
muriendo posteriormente a causa de las condiciones terribles de vida.
Short time after they left, they died because of the terrible conditions in the prisons.
Este castillo de Mioland tiene una fama muy triste.
This castle has a very sad fame.
En el medioevo se decía que quien llega a Mioland no sale nunca más.
In the Middle Ages, the fame was that whoever would come to Mioland Castle would never leave it.
Tenía el castillo 3 niveles de prisiones.
It had 3 different kinds of prisons.
La prisión al primer nivel, donde aún se ve el sol,
The first level, where the sun still comes in,
se llamaba Esperanza.
it was named Hope.
Las prisiones a medio nivel con pequeñas ventanitas se llamaba Purgatorio.
Then at the second level, prisons had small windows, and the name was Purgatory.
Y las prisiones subterráneas, que tienen túneles muy oscuros y húmedos, le llamaban infierno.
And then the prisons beneath the earth, humid, no light, they were called hell.
Los valdenses eran prisioneros en el infierno y en el purgatorio.
So the Waldenses were to hell or purgatory.
Si pudiésemos ver dentro los niveles de prisiones, en muchas de ellas están grabadas las fechas, están grabados nombres e incluso algunos versículos bíblicos.
If we could get into the prisons, we would see engraved names, dates, and Bible verses.
Este castillo es también famoso porque albergó a algunos personajes ilustres de la Francia del siglo XVIII.
Also, this place was famous because some illustrious names of people were imprisoned here.
En este castillo, por ejemplo, estuvo prisionero un famoso noble francés que se llamó el Marqués de Sade.
Here he was in prison, a famous French nobleman. His name was the Marquis of Sade.
El Marqués de Sade fue famoso por su crueldad y por los innumerables crímenes que cometió.
He was famous or infamous because of the many terrible crimes that he committed.
Y esta fue su prisión.
And this was the prison that he was in.
After leaving France, we traveled back to the valleys of the Waldenses to continue our research. It is here in Bobbio Pellice that we will look at the history of the Waldenses in their glorious return to their valleys.
Here we are in Torre Pellice, and this is in the Waldensian headquarters of the valleys here. And right here is a monument to Enrico Arnaud, or Henry Arnaud. He was a minister of the Waldensian people, and he led the resistance when the Duke of Savoy published an edict to exterminate and to get rid of all the Waldensians. He led the resistance, and then when they went to Europe for 2.5 years, they decided they wanted to come back to these valleys. And so he led the glorious return, it's called, in 1689 and 1690. It was that they came over these mountains over here, very difficult return, but he was actually a soldier as well, but he was a Waldensian pastor, and so this is a monument to his heroism, and I believe he's got a Bible in his belt. I don't know if you can see it.
After their time in Geneva, they longed for places like this one, with watered valleys and beautiful mountains.
Aquí estamos, el pueblo valdense viviendo en el exilio, organiza el llamado regreso a la patria.
The Waldenses living in exile, they organized what's called the glorious return to their own country here.
Muchos valdenses estaban diseminados en Suiza y en Alemania.
Many Waldenses were scattered all over Switzerland and Germany.
Pero la clase dirigente estaba en Ginebra.
But the directors, the ones that were in charge of the Waldenses, were in Geneva.
Josué Janabel, el héroe valdense,
Joshua Genavel, the Waldensian hero,
ya anciano,
he was older at that time.
Escribe las instrucciones.
He had written the instructions about how to do this.
Y planea cómo regresar.
And he planned how to return.
Hubieron 3 intentos que no
Yeah, there were 3 failed attempts before that.
Y en esta ocasión, en agosto de 1689,
in 1689, on this occasion,
al mando del pastor Henri Arnaud,
Pastor Henry Arnaud,
los valdenses se organizan
Under his direction, they organized
con un pequeño ejército,
with a little army,
y ellos fueron financiados
and they were financed.
por el rey de Inglaterra, Guillermo de Orange.
The King of England, William of Orange.
El rey de Inglaterra, que era príncipe de Holanda, amigo de los Waldenses de mucho tiempo.
He was a prince of Holland, and he was a very close friend of the Waldenses.
Dio dinero.
He gave money
para que ellos pudieran comprar armas, víveres y
so they could buy
organizarse.
supplies and food and weapons and to get organized.
At the end of August of 1689 on the beach of Lake Geneva, the Waldenses crossed in boats and they began a march of 16 days with 80 pounds or more on their back. As Moses led the children of Israel out of Egypt into the wilderness and then into the promised land, so it was that Henry Arnaud was the one that God chose to lead the Waldenses out of their captivity and to bring them back into their valleys. There was 1,200 men in 10 groups, and they were led by Pastor Arnaud. We are now in the valley of Belzigla, which was the last pass they had to go through before going home. With rivers that pour from great giant glaciers, it is a reminder of the purity of the truth. Even though it's dashed upon the rocks, it is the process that God uses to purify the water, and thus it is with us. As Christians, when we go through hard times, it is God's way of purifying our hearts for heaven. In this valley is a little Waldense community. It even comes complete with a school for the children that live high in these mountains. With small resistance from the Savoy, they eventually were able to fight their way through this last spot. It looks almost impossible to pass over this giant rampart on the left. Once they reach the summit and crossed over into the other side, they come to the place of the Invincibles, which is one of the locations that we looked at earlier. As they pass through this steep gorge and this rocky passageway, they see their old home from a distance. You can only imagine what it must have been like as their hearts were stirred with excitement as they came into this valley. But before going to their houses, they came to this place called Sabaud. Each stone on this monument symbolizes different colonies where the Waldenses live in their valleys, and even one discolored stone that comes clear from Uruguay.
This is the monument of Sabaud, which memorializes the glorious return of the Waldenses to their valleys here.
Fue construido en el 200 aniversario del glorioso retorno.
It was constructed on the 200th anniversary of the glorious return.
Tenemos una hermosa vista del pueblo.
We have a beautiful view of the village down here.
Podemos apreciar el templo valdense.
We can see the Waldensian temple down there.
La antigua campanario y la casa pastoral, que es una de las más antiguas.
And the pastoral or the parsonage is one of the oldest.
Looking back at the monument in Sabaud, we catch up with Hector. Here we can see the temple and also this ancient bell tower in the Valley of Bobbio.
Alright, we're here, and this is the year this house was built, 1597, and since then it has been the house for the ministers to the Waldensian church right here in front of me. 1997.
All the Waldense churches are similar in their architecture. This one has 3 stoves to keep the congregation warm, and the pillars and arches give this temple a special effect. Back on the hill of Sabaud, we see a very old chestnut tree. Chestnut trees are very important to the people of the valleys.
This tree is over 500 years old. It's a chestnut tree that was actually here, documented that it was here on the Glorious Return in 1689 when they came on the Glorious Return.
Chestnuts have a tough, spiny skin, but inside is a smooth nut. In the open-air market on Friday, you can smell roasting chestnuts on an open fire. Roasted chestnuts have a very robust flavor. Chestnuts are considered a perfect food, and it was a staple for the Waldenses. It's very interesting that chestnuts are like manna. You can do many things with them. But chestnut trees also have a symbolic value to these people. In Torpilice is this main valley temple. This temple has a very delicate look. And with the vaulted ceiling, it has excellent acoustics. And this pulpit is one of the most beautiful of all the ones I saw in the valleys. In close proximity to the temple is this museum. This is a great place to go and see old artifacts of the Waldenses in their time. Looking across the street, we come to the Waldense headquarters. Inside is a beautiful fresco of an old mighty oak tree. As you can see, the roots of the tree are secured on the rock, while the branches are holding the Holy Bible. So as the Waldenses were grounded in the rock Jesus Christ, they shared the scriptures with those that they came in contact with, feeding them the bread of life. Our next location is up in Prali, where the only church was still standing after the papal takeover. After crossing this bridge, we will make our way to the right and go up a beautiful road to the highest village in the Waldense territory. Nestled in these mountains, Prali really gives you that alpine feel. Behind some stores, you can still see this very old temple and bell tower. We arrived late in the day, but the pastor was so kind to us that he let us look around and film here. The Catholics had the Waldenses bells to sound different from theirs, so the people knew which church to go to.
So here we are in Prali, Gigo de Prali, and this is up the Prali Valley. It's one of the highest villages in the Prali Valley, if not the highest. And it's quite significant where I'm standing because in the Glorious Return in 1689 approximately, they came up here, Henry Arnaud and his men who were trying to take over their country again. They came up here and they found that this was the only of all the Waldensian churches that had not been completely razed to the ground and destroyed. And so they found that it had been taken over by the Catholics, and it was full of images. So they took all the images and threw them out of the church, and they held a Sunday service here with him standing right on the threshold here about where I am. I think I read somewhere that he was actually on a stump out in front of the church, approximately over here in front of me about 20 or 30 feet. And they had a service, and there were so many people that they wouldn't fit inside the church, and so they had the service here. So it was a wonderful service. It was a glorious return, and this is quite significant because of all their Waldensian churches. This is the only one that wasn't destroyed in the persecution. So it's a real thrill to be here. I've read the story. I think you can read it in several places. History of Protestantism by James Wiley is one place where you can read that story.
Leaving Praligigo, we move forward to 1827, when the church was reestablished and they had some help with education.
Okay, so now we're going to stop and see General Beckwith's school, Charles Beckwith. He was a general, a British general, and he was injured during a military battle, I think, and lost part of his leg. And he was quite wealthy. And I don't know all the history, but I know that he loved the Waldensian people. He was a devout Christian, and he really loved the Waldensian people. He read about their history, and he came over here, I believe, in 1827 was the first time he came to the Waldensian valleys and saw that they needed schools, and so he spent a large fortune, and he helped develop schools. I'm not sure how many schools, but several, and this is one of the original schools that he developed. And this one was in 1837, right here. And so if we go inside, we can see they're pretty rustic schools, but they did have a chalk and they had blackboard, and he gave materials, basic instructional materials. And he loved the people, and he was a great benefactor to the Waldenses, and they still remember him with a lot of love. Little doorknob. So in the winter time they had to have heat, so here's a nice little stove. And there's a map back there, you can see. Here's a picture of General Beckwith over there, Charles Beckwith. Here he is here, see? You might want to do this picture because you can see he lost his lower leg. His left lower leg is gone. He's wearing a prosthesis. They didn't have very good prosthetics back then. But he was a real gentleman, and he really loved the people over here. Here's some original school books that they used, textbooks and primers. Most of them are very, very simple books, but and here's the Bible over here, and they used the Bible for their main textbook. Here's the alphabet. So he was very loved by the Waldensian people.
It is sad that persecution did not end in the 1600s, as you will see in this next story.
We are in this little town, Villar Pelice. It's one of the smallest little villages, the Waldensian villages here.
Durante la guerra,
During the war,
los alemanes estaban aquí.
the Germans were here.
Cuando cae Benito Mussolini
When Mussolini fell,
y fue asesinado, cayó,
He
el
was
régimen fascista cayó,
and the fascist regime fell when he was assassinated,
se organizan los llamados movimientos de resistencia.
they started forming the movements of resistance.
Son los alpinos.
These were called the Alpine movement of resistance.
Stefan went on to tell us that the Waldenses were fighting in the resistance because they believed in freedom as they always had from their very beginnings.
En agosto de 1944
In August of 1944,
había un joven valdense
there was a young Waldensian man.
llamado Willy Jervis.
His name was Willie Jervis.
Él formaba parte del movimiento de resistencia contra los nazis.
So he formed a movement, he joined the movement, resistance movement against the Nazis,
Y fue capturado por los alemanes.
and he was captured by the Germans.
Estuvo unos meses prisionero en Torino con tortura.
He was tortured in prison in Torino for several months.
Y el 5 de agosto,
And on August 5, 1944,
junto con otros 4 prisioneros,
together with 4 other prisoners,
fue traído aquí
he was brought here to this exact spot
para infundir terror en la población,
to help terrorize the people in this community,
porque él era de aquí
because since he was from here,
y fue ahorcado en esta plaza, en este edificio.
and he was hung from this building up there on that veranda, that porch on that building right over there.
Y incluso hay fotos.
And we actually have pictures of him hanging there.
Él dijo una frase antes de ser justiciado.
Before he was killed, he said a phrase, famous saying.
Él dijo, no me lloren.
He said, "Don't cry for me.
Y no me digan pobrecito.
Don't call me poor little man.
Muero por servir a mis ideales."
I died in order to serve my ideals."
Y un dato importante a destacar de este joven
And one detail that stands out about this young man,
es que era un sincero creyente.
that he was a true, sincere believer.
Él tenía una pequeña Biblia
He had a little tiny Bible,
y en esa Biblia escribió muchas memorias.
and he wrote many of his memoirs, many things about what had happened in this little Bible.
Y la mantuvo hasta el momento de morir en la horca.
And he carried that little Bible with him up until the very moment that he died from hanging up there on that veranda.
Y dice que la puso en el bolsillo.
He put it in his pocket.
El bolsillo estaba roto
His pocket was torn.
y cuando cae y muere,
When he actually fell down, when they pulled out his support from under him and he hung there,
la pequeña Biblia corre por su pierna y cae.
the little Bible fell down through his pants, down his leg, and fell out onto the floor of the veranda.
Un gran testimonio de fe.
A great testimony of faith.
In our last story, we go to Aurora. This is a story of Christian love and forgiveness that we can learn from.
So here we are up in the valley of Aurora, the Aurora Valley, R-O-R-A, and we're about 7 miles from down in the valley at the Lucerna, where we were a while ago. And this is a quite interesting spot because in this area, Duke Victor Amadeo II of Savoy was being besieged in Torino and Pinarello by French forces that were trying to take over his kingdom. And he escaped up into these valleys, ran for his life, and he came to this little town, this little Waldensian town, and he came to this exact spot. I believe it's this house right behind me here, if not this one over here. And he stayed here hidden in this Waldensian home for over a week. And then he heard that the French forces, he got messages that the French forces had receded and gone back away, and it was safe for him to go back, and so he left. And it's interesting because his grandfather, the Duke of Savoy, had killed over 10,000 Waldenses in this very area.
History tells us that Victor came to a Waldense family, and they showed him unconditional love and took care of his needs. So in turn he gave them 2 gifts, a large silver spoon, and he gave them a certificate that they could legally have a funeral for their dead relatives, for it was the Catholics that made it illegal for them to have funeral services.
One other time they captured one soldier out of about 3,000, and they treated him with love and respect and let him go after a few days. And what did he do? He turned around and got some more soldiers and came up and tried to kill a whole bunch more Waldenses. So even though they were mistreated by their enemies, they loved Victor Amadeo and they took care of him here. They rescued him from certain death from the French. And it's an example of how we should also love our enemies like Jesus said to do.
Since Vatican II, history has been rewritten, and many are confused about the part that the Waldenses had to play in the chain of events that led to the Protestant Reformation, and also the sacred truths that have been covered up for hundreds of years. Truths like the antiquity of the Waldenses that go clear back to apostolic origin, the preservation of the Bible from the Textus Receptus, the keeping of the Sabbath instead of Sunday, and the proper way of doing evangelism to reach thousands for Christ. It's interesting that most of the documents of the Waldenses were destroyed by the papists and they were burned. But it's interesting that we can learn a lot about the Waldenses from their persecutors. So to those documents and other historical books we turn to next.